All right. Welcome to Coiled's October webinar. Hi, Matt and Chris.
Hey, Christiana. Hey, Chris.
Hey, good to be here.
Happy to have you. Yeah. So today we're doing scaling your data pipelines with Prefect and Coiled with Matt and Chris, and I'm Christiana from the Coiled team. And we would love, as you're joining in, to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're calling in from.
So, hi everyone, just to give context. So I think we're planning to get started in a couple of minutes. We're gonna wait for some folks to show up. In the meantime, so Chris and I actually know each other. We used to sort of live close to each other in Oakland. Were you actually working at Prefect at the time, Chris, or was that pre-Prefect?
No, yeah, I started Prefect when I was in DC. I was there for 2 weeks and then headed over to Oakland, yeah.
Okay, great. Before the call, we're also saying like, what would be a good icebreaker as folks are rolling in to have sort of a fun activity to play with. And I thought ask Chris what his favorite Dask feature and his least favorite Dask feature were. And if folks also have answers for that question, put them in the chat. Christian, I'm actually not seeing the chat. I'm not on YouTube. So if you can handle the chat there and post again some responses. So again, favorite Dask feature and least favorite Dask feature. Chris, any response?
Yeah, so favorite, this is kind of cheap, but it comes to mind because of how recent it was implemented, is native async support. So we actually really took advantage of that with our latest kind of technical preview product called Orion, and it's async first, which our current instantiation of Prefect, like the client side, is not async compatible. And so one of the there's a lot of reasons we didn't do it, but one of them was Dask.
So just to be clear, it sounds like you're saying like submit, get a future, and like await future, or async for thing and as completed futures. That's what you're talking about?
Exactly, yeah.
To be fair, that was implemented like several years ago. You could have done that with Prefect a while ago as well.
So there is some aspect of it though that we needed, which I will fully admit I don't remember, but I can point to the PR that we were waiting on.
Okay, cool. And least favorite Dask feature?
Least favorite is tricky. I don't know that I have a least favorite, to be completely honest.
Can anyone in the chat help out Chris? Christiana, what is a least favorite Dask feature that's mentioned?
Well, let's see. No one has. Yeah, in case you've just joined, we're just warming up with a question about favorite or least favorite Dask feature. So if Kevin Coe says annotations.
Annotations, yeah. So with Dask.annotate. I hope that's the most favorite Dask feature rather than least favorite. That was added recently. It's been actually really cool. It's cool seeing, it's a really composable feature. People use lots of different kinds of things.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
I will say maybe the least loved feature of Dask, probably Dask Bag. I feel it is like the least exciting of all the Dask collections and APIs. Still a pragmatic one.
I used Dask Bag one time, like 3 years ago, and will admit I found it just, yeah, more clunky than I was expecting compared to some of the other Dask collections. But I mean, I think that's,
Well, it's like the classic Spark RDD. It was also modeled after like my previous successful project, PyTools, which was also a fun thing to play. But are we at time, Christian? Are we good to go?
Yeah, so we can get started. In case you just joined, I think we've had a few more people who just jumped in. Tonight, we're having a webinar with Matt Rocklin and Chris White, scaling your data pipelines with Prefect and Coiled. So we're going to jump in just a second. But first, I'm just going to read Matt and Chris's bios so you have a little bit of background, and then we'll jump in. But in the meantime, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're calling in from. So first up, Chris. Chris White is currently the Chief Technology Officer of Prefect, overseeing the design and implementation of the next generation of data workflow automation systems. Chris began his journey into data tooling while getting his PhD in mathematics at the University of Texas at Austin, where he researched optimization guarantees for highly non-convex data-driven problems. As a longtime data and software practitioner, he has a passion for building tools that make engineers' lives easier and their teams more successful. And then
So I
Matt
gotta say, highly non-convex optimization problems. Chris, that is pretty exciting PhD work there.
I mean, we can go into that and change topics right here on the fly if we want.
The audience would love it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. And then Matt. So Matt Rocklin is the CEO of Coiled, the scalable desk-based cloud platform that lets data professionals accelerate computation through parallelization. Matt is also the initial author of Coiled's underlying technology, Dask, and an active contributor to the Python ecosystem. Dask is the leading Python native solution for distributed computing. So that's a little bit about Matt and Chris. I'm gonna let you two take it away. And let's have a good time. Let's do it.
Sounds great. So
Great.
Chris, I'll hand it over to you in just a second. I just wanted to
Okay.
do a prompt for sort of the webinar. So I love Prefect because it seems to handle lots of user needs. A lot of people who used to bug me about things no longer bother me about those feature requests, which is lovely. I'll admit though, I've actually never used Prefect. And so I will have sort of the controversial stance of, do I even need it? If I'm very good at using Dask, which arguably I am, what does Prefect offer me? Why would I want to use Prefect? Why would I want to add a new layer of abstraction on top of Dask? So sell me on Prefect, Chris.
That's actually a perfect prompt because I definitely wrote the outline of our conversation today kind of centered around what I believe to be, someone who uses Dask potentially heavily, or maybe just a little bit, but a Dask user, and want to know what is Prefect all about and why is Prefect and Coiled, why are we even talking together right now? And so Matt, maybe can you confirm that you can see the first slide? Did you, sorry, I didn't see if.
Matt's muted, but you're good. Yep, we're seeing
Okay,
it.
cool.
Yes, sorry, I was muted, but yes, totally can see.
Yeah, okay, good stuff. So this is just a little quick agenda just to set the stage. I want to talk a little bit about the data pipeline landscape, where Prefect fits into it. What are some of the challenges? I have data engineering here. That is kind of our historical bread and butter, but as we'll see and talk about, there's absolutely nothing here that confines us to data engineering. In fact, one of the reasons Prefect was built was to kind of merge the workflows of data engineers and data scientists into a unified framework. So we'll talk about some of the challenges, discuss at a high level at least, and we can get into the technical weeds as needed, some examples of how Prefect and Coiled work together. And then, maybe leave some time at the end to just kind of discuss some more open-ended questions about, trends and what we're seeing on the ground with the different user bases. So before I kind of click to this next slide, if you go search Prefect on Google or something, what you're going to probably find is some verbiage around workflow orchestration or data flow automation. And so I want to kind of start by asking, actually, Matt, I'll ask you, what do you think orchestration means? And just no additional context, just what does that mean to you?
So the thing that comes to mind, so I use the term scheduling in Dask, which is you got a lot of workers and you got a lot of work and you need to allocate that work to all those workers. That's a very sort of broad thing that, like a foreman at a job site might also handle. Orchestration, maybe you also got some time element in there. So you're thinking oh, not only do I want to get this work done as quickly as possible, but I want to make sure that it happens at a certain cadence. Without thinking too much about what Prefect does that I know, that's my gut definition.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I mean, Kubernetes, for example, is a container orchestrator, does exactly what you're describing, right? It schedules images or containers to run on different nodes based on lots of different config settings, et cetera. And so here's my proposed definition. So orchestration is the governance of state transitions through policies and rules. And so in the case that you just— It's not as fun
a definition as I had, Chris, I'm sorry.
Hey, we already said I'm a math person, so we're getting definitions today, and we're gonna go into those. We have to be as precise as possible. And so what you just said, Matt, this idea of scheduling something, I propose can be encapsulated. And this is it's a little abstract, but you can encode a lot of different activity in this framework, which is the process of moving something from a scheduled state, so something needs to happen, to a submitted state where it has been actively put into the world somehow. So submitted to a worker to be processed, submitted to a node to be run, something like that. So I think a lot of those sorts of scheduling activities are very resource based, but there are other more business logic state transitions that you might care to orchestrate. So just for example, if something fails, you want to retry it. That can be described as a state transition where anytime something enters a failed state, it needs to enter a retrying state. That retrying state might then go to another scheduled state, that encodes the retry delay that you expect, and so on and so forth. And you can go from pending to running, et cetera. And so one of the ways that we really do think about orchestration, and you can really see this in our latest product launch, is this definition. So we're all about governing state transitions.
So is heckling welcome, Chris, throughout this?
Oh, please heckle, both from you and from the audience. Like, ask away. Let's keep this conversational.
So again, like with my premise of like, I could, anything Prefect can do, Dask can do better. Or maybe state my statement that way. Like, anyone who's worked deeply on the Dask scheduler, which is like all of 20 people in the world, like we got the same thing. We got a bunch of states, got a bunch of state transitions. We like handle inputs from the world. We manage those states. We have all of those things forward in time. How is Prefect any different? How is Prefect orchestration different from Dask scheduling? This definition feels like it could apply equally well to either one.
So that is, you're actually setting up kind of my next slide, but I'm not going to jump to it too quickly because I don't think it'll register immediately. I would propose that most developer tools are in the business of doing some sort of orchestration activity. And the biggest thing that differentiates the tools is like where their value addition is really happening. And I would argue for Dask, and kind of similarly for Kubernetes, it's this resource type of orchestration that's happening. Like you're very much scheduling things based on memory, size, just availability of workers and things like that. And Prefect focuses, and we'll get into this some other terminology here in a little bit, but focuses a little bit more on orchestrating at a slightly one level higher of abstraction. So most things that people orchestrate through Prefect, they think of at the business logic layer. So for example, they want to orchestrate a task which is maybe a really big task. It's build machine learning model. That's probably a little too big of a task, but you could do it. And Prefect would care about that at that level, even though there's a ton of granular steps happening within that individual task. Whereas Dask, for example, if you are doing something with a Dask data frame or Dask GLM or Dask ML or something, you're building a machine learning model and you're orchestrating it, but at a way lower level of abstraction that you might not even need visibility into at the end of the day. Like you're trying to hide some of that and we're trying to elevate it. And I think that's one of the big differences. And so I guess another aspect here though, so here's a little caricature of a slice of the data landscape. So another aspect of orchestration is this idea of gluing different tools together and managing how they communicate with each other, a lot of the times through state. And so I'll give an example in a second. But first off, I guess, the data science space, the tools are huge. And also I just want to be, I'm defining these job functions based on tools they use. That's maybe a little unfair and not true to form, but I think most people would agree that, like, generally speaking, if you're a heavy, for example, DBT user, you're probably a data engineer. And if you're a very heavy H2O user or something, then you're probably a data scientist. But one thing that comes up time and time again for pretty much anyone in the data profession is just gluing together different tools and jobs and processes. So a really common thing that we've seen, for example, is I use Fivetran to manage an ETL, a batch ETL process. And whenever my, say, data warehouse has been updated, I then want a DBT job to run that maybe does something. And then maybe I want some custom code to run that generates a report that I then push to Looker. And that sort of glue code is another kind of piece of orchestration here. And it's defined once again by state transitions. When the Fivetran job has entered a completed or success state, I then want to trigger a DBT job to enter a running state. When it is successfully completed, I want to do another thing. And then maybe even want to respond to failure in a first class way, right? That's another big aspect here, is that in Prefect, you can very much trigger conditional branches of logic based on failure modes. So you might want to trigger, an alert would be a really simple example of a branch of a workflow. but you can imagine more complicated things. Like if something fails in a certain way, then you want to just trigger an entirely different workflow to run that maybe has less compute requirements or something like that. And so, at the end of the day, all of these are kind of pieces of a larger machine, which is achieving some business objective. And a lot of Prefect workflows, when you look at them and you look at the task names, this is kind of the level of abstraction that they live at. And so what are some of the things that Prefect layers in here? So first off, it just helps you write that glue code. That's pretty simple. It helps you orchestrate that glue code, which might be scheduling, might be providing a secure API to trigger some of these things. Observability across this stack is another piece that sometimes, for example, something like Datadog, which operates more at the compute layer, could give you a lot of observability into some subset of these tools. But if you want observability at the job level, then you need something else. And then when you're talking about jobs across your full stack, then you need yet another thing. And that's really where Prefect comes in, is that single pane of glass, to use a turn of phrase. And providing that unified framework for these 3 user personas is another big aspect here. So we have a lot of users who are deeply technical and maybe deep data scientists, but then we have another pretty large user base of people who are data analysts and who maybe are used to triggering things via button push with maybe some YAML config. Were you about to ask something, Matt?
No, you're good.
Cool. So what are some of the challenges that I was kind of going over, just like listed out, that anyone building any sort of data pipeline or even interacting with the pipeline, maybe you're not even the builder of the pipeline, you're just a user or someone who is waiting on the downstream results of the pipeline. So observability is just a big one, right? So much of what people do is driven by observability.
So let me dig into that one for a second. So Dask provides observability. Like, how does Prefect and Dask differ in how they provide observability?
So Dask does provide observability, but once again, at a much more detailed layer. So here's something Dask could not provide observability into: the absence of an event, for example. So let's say that you have a really intensive, maybe even a Dask compute job that you want to run on a schedule. Dask would not be able to tell you when that job fails to run. But if it was already running, you could then get observability into like how it's being distributed across your cluster and things like that. Prefect, on the other hand, you could, in this exact use case I'm describing, you could think of as a dashboard for a cron scheduler. You see the scheduled states, you can confirm when they will run in the future. And if they don't run, you can figure out, get a proactive alert first off, and then figure out maybe why they didn't run. Maybe they got stuck in trying to talk to your Kubernetes cluster, the Coiled API, or maybe there's some large outage in your infrastructure or something like that. So that's a big one.
Okay.
Scalability too. And what I mean here is just kind of this trying to reduce the amount of code that you need to refactor to unlock scale. And I'll talk about some use cases of how some of this shows up in things that are maybe not immediately obvious that Dask could help. Recoverability is another one. So this is something too that, you could instrument in Dask, but you'd have to write some custom code for, which, recoverability requires some notion of caching of results, some way of recovering those results and knowing that the task at hand has already succeeded in a meaningful way in the recent past, pulling that data in. And one of the goals of Prefect is to remove a lot of that code that you end up having to maintain for yourself and extend for yourself in all sorts of custom ways. Automation, so this is kind of that glue code, auto providing an API for you to trigger things and observe things through. Security, so this is, we're not probably going to talk too much about this one today, but one of the ways in which Prefect is architected is all orchestration. So state, if you really believe me that orchestration can be encoded in state, then you may also agree that an orchestrator doesn't actually need access to your execution environment. All of this can happen over messages sent via API. And so that's a big aspect of of Prefect is this ability to completely control your execution environment and the data that's being passed around your tasks without actually having to send it to the SaaS platform that you're wired up to. And yeah, makes healthcare companies and finance companies quite happy when they don't have to move their data around or expose it to third parties. Then compliance. So this is another type of orchestration, is just tracking activity, right? This person created this workflow at this time. This other person ran it at this other time. Then this other person logged into the dashboard to check on its status at this other time, et cetera. You can imagine all the different reporting that you might want around business critical workflows. And at the end of the day too, like just even ignoring DAS for 1 second, I mentioned cron earlier. Just the act of cron scheduling a Python script introduces a ton of these kind of observability and recoverability problems. You have to set up a VM that you have to check in on. Yeah, what were you gonna say, Matt?
So I guess like all this is really high level, right? And I get it. I mean, I think this is, I'm gonna push on you a little bit here. Like this is kind of, this is the kind of startups I think any startup would have about like, oh, we're secure, we have observability, we have scalability, we have compliance. This is like, you've clearly rebranded recently and you've like been given a nice slide deck. But I'm gonna push on that, like, how is this different from what Dask would provide? How is this Prefect? Why should I use Prefect? I feel I'm getting like the high level pitch here. So I'm gonna push you a little bit and see if I can get you into more meat, more details. I'm gonna challenge you.
No, I think it's totally fair. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more buzzwordy, but for a very specific reason. But that's the interesting thing, is that what you're asking for is a positive outcome of using Prefect, and most people are not comfortable living in this world that I'm describing entirely, and that is the reason you use Prefect. Is these are the things Prefect doesn't unlock, for example, a new way to build a machine learning model, but it removes a lot of the crufty code that every person building machine learning models has to do. And I think that's the key, is we're very happy and comfortable living in that space, which we have called negative engineering. So that's the reason I switched slides.
So Ben Mueller from the chat is telling me to go easy on you.
Oh, no. We're friends here. It's okay.
Yeah. And so maybe what I should say is that all these users who use Prefect seem to love Prefect. I just don't get it. So I want to figure out more deeply why everyone seems to love Prefect. And what I'm hearing you say is that actually it's just like there's a lot of niceties to using it as a platform, which are kind of hard to describe. It's like eating a fine meal or something. It's hard to describe why it tastes good. But that's an unsatisfying answer. I might kind of want to get the top 5 features of Prefect that people love, but I'm also happy to let you go and get into those things.
No, I actually think it's a very important question, because I think what a lot of engineers, especially more senior engineers, tend to do is see how they could solve each of these individual problems for all of their different use cases. Like just, let's say retries. Anyone on this call or chat could write try except time.sleep run function again, right? Like that is not a hard piece of code to write, but you have to write it. And you have to write it in multiple ways, and you might be trying accepting certain types of errors. And eventually, maybe you want exponential backoff, and then maybe your process dies and you have to retry from there. So how do you recover that state? And it kind of, you go down this slippery slope. And like, once again, I'm sure that you can think of how you would solve that problem. But the catch is, why would you keep solving that same problem over and over again? And that is really the kind of extensibility that you get. And then especially for those that aren't that senior and haven't seen a lot of these problems, you get a batteries included way to kind of unlock all of those little like bullet points that I mentioned before, without having to think deeply about how to set something up in some complicated environment. One of our early users once said something like, I'm a data engineer, not really a software engineer. And using Prefect, I was able to, write a fault tolerant workflow that runs through an API in Kubernetes anytime I want it. And like, I have no business setting up such a thing. And so kind of unlocking a lot of these things that I think a lot of engineers tend to take for granted because they know how they would write custom code for is the key here.
Okay. I'll let you keep going with the slide presentation, and I'll hammer you a bit more on what those 5 things are after it.
Well, I mean, this is exactly, you're following the flow perfectly. So, I mean, what do you think negative engineering is, Matt?
Well, I'm actually
Since we've been talking about it now.
I'm gonna again quote from Ben, who's again your champion on the chat.
Thank you, Ben.
He says, "I love that it isn't Airflow. It works easily out of the box. Has an incredible community, excellent documentation, and it can be debugged locally and with great ease. There are many more things, but these are some of the things that jump to mind." So I'm going to push now both on Ben and Chris. Like, again, great documentation, works out of the box, isn't the competitor, can be debugged. These are great features of any product. But what is it that makes up Prefect? Like, if I give me the 5 killer features of Prefect. And again, I'm happy to wait in the slide presentation, but that's.
What would you do, Matt, if you were running, if you're at a new job, they use this service, let's say it's Fivetran, which just kind of has this automatic thing that's set up to move data from your production database to your data warehouse. And then you're also responsible for producing some downstream reports based on that data warehouse, running some like SQL queries through dbt. How would you instrument that pipeline? And for the record, Fivetran is not code first. So they do have a developer API, but it's not code first. So what do you do?
I would tend to use Dask because it's a framework that I know.
What do you mean by that? How would you use Dask for that?
Sorry, so my understanding is that every day there's something that has to happen. So I probably set up some Python code with periodic callback. Or actually, just Python, have some script running, right? It would say every day run this function. If it does this thing, then do this. If it does the other thing, then do that. So I would just use a Python script. Maybe I would run it in some sort of daemons to make sure it's stayed up.
Okay, so one day you wait. So first off, how do you confirm for yourself daily that it is in fact running? Do you just assume that the absence of a complaint is success?
It's a good question. Maybe I put it in some system that I trust that runs things in a way that I trust that it runs it. I just kind of believe that it runs. A Kubernetes kind of thing. Or there's lots of other systems that do this. But so
your proof of work will just be implicit, just like Kubernetes works, so I'll trust it. Totally fine, totally legit. And then what do you do if one day you do hear complaints and it hasn't been running for 2 days? Then what do you do?
Well, I install Prefect and use Prefect instead.
Well, but there's the main thing that I'm trying to get at here is that there's a lot of activities that you would be doing. Don't get me wrong, everything you're saying makes a ton of sense and things that we've all, I think, done at various times in our career.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very common story, and just having a single dedicated way that you and everyone on your team knows to write that exact code that we're talking about, if this then that, put it into Kubernetes in this way. This is the way we recommend you put it into Kubernetes. Here's where you go to confirm proof of work, and here's where you go if you hear that it didn't work. It's actually a quite powerful feature set, even though it doesn't sound very sexy. And I think that's the key. And that's so just to kind of move ahead here with this slide that's hanging out. So this is all of the effort that engineers spend to ensure, I use the word innovative code. The point I'm trying to make there, it's whatever the custom code is that you're actually hired to write, like building a model, moving some data around, keeping schemas up to date, whatever. But to ensure that it actually runs successfully and to completion. And all of the activities associated with this. And most people that we talk to, especially in data engineering and data science, will say that some massive portion of their time goes to these sorts of efforts, right? And data scientists, a lot of the time, it tends to be a lot of data cleaning activity that falls in this category. And for data engineers, it's usually the glue code, just because there's so many different systems and scheduling it and making sure that it's always running and all of this jazz. And then refactoring for different tech environments and multi-environment problems, like having 3 different Kubernetes clusters that you have to interact with somehow. And so, yeah. And if you can cut that down by 10%, right, you've doubled your productivity.
Okay, so your example, I was being a little cheeky before. Your example of forcing me to run through the process of running something every day, make sure that it runs, is a good example. That forced me to think about the problem a bit more. But I'm questioning Prefect, how do I know that Prefect hasn't gone down? You've got some database that's running all the time, and depending on some cloud SaaS service that you're running, or doing that internally. How is it that I can trust Prefect to be around and to be and to give me that signal.
Well, that's kind of, I guess, the nice separation of concerns that you have with any tool that defining the problem in this way allows for, is that is what Prefect is as a product. And so that is our job to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay.
But I'm not being cheeky there, right? Like, it is an important distinction. Like, you focus on that thing, we'll focus on our thing, and you now have a person you can even complain to if that API goes down and something, it causes some business disruption. You actually have money that you can save, for example, if that's in your contract or something.
Sounds great.
And I would argue, and this is, I think, what you are arguing, is that Coiled does also solve a very similar, like, you could rebrand Coiled as a negative engineering problem of setting up, managing Dask clusters, getting observability into your Dask clusters, et cetera. Like, it is the same thing. It's just, of course, Coiled has a more, I think, results focused outcome that you can really point to kind of universally. So, like, don't really need a lot of this negative engineering verbiage.
Yeah, we're definitely not going to tell you if your job didn't run. We're definitely just going to make sure that your job runs as quickly and most powerfully as possible. We're in the business of making hammers. You're in the business of making sure that when you hit your thumb, someone cries out, ouch.
Yeah, that's well said. But also, like, right, a lot of the things that Coiled does do is in this space, which is just, how do I, like, track the cost, for example, of my Dask cluster? And how can I point at certain users that, hey, you're using up way too much compute time? That's something that a lot of people could instrument themselves. Of course, everything you could always write yourself, but, like, why do it whenever I could pay, Matt Rocklin and team to do it for me with a nice shiny dashboard?
I feel like all cloud SaaS companies should just make, like, some basic pitch deck, which is, like, very generic. Like, you could do this yourself, but instead we'll do it for you. We'll charge you a bit of money. It'll be less money than you would spend on the half an FTE you'll be spending on it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so, yeah, you've been poking me through real world examples, and I've been keeping it high level. So let's, like, talk a little bit more. Okay, there we go. A little bit more about some use cases in words. So, like, I'm not going to necessarily share any code at this exact moment, but so one way that people use Prefect and Coiled or Prefect and Dask together is just, they don't even necessarily care about Dask. So this is what I mean by scaling natively in Prefect. And so what might this look like? So maybe a data engineer is using this feature called Prefect mapping, probably is what you think it is. Task.map spawns a bunch of dynamic copies of your task and then runs them and orchestrates them and, gives you a view into them. And you want to do that for every row of some large database table. And you just need some large compute environment to do this. You want to make it highly parallelizable. Maybe it's 100,000 rows, which doing it all at once, you might just have some time constraint. So you can just use the Prefect Dask executor with or without a distributed cluster, just kind of depends on what your setup is. And you don't care about Dask at all. Dask is just another word in the Prefect language, but this kind of gives you an interface to Dask to get that parallelism natively. So that's one world. Another world are if you have task-specific resources and maybe you're already a Dask user. So this is one that we see a lot. You have some workers that are attached to some machines, maybe that have some GPUs, and you don't want to use those machines too frequently, but when they're necessary, you want to make sure they do in fact get spun up and torn down, and that certain tasks get sent to them. So Dask has using annotations, has the way to in worker resources to send these tasks to the right machines, and then Prefect, of course, gives you an interface on top of that to do that, and then you can combine it with a bunch of other activity that might be outside of Dask purview. And then another way, very honestly, is maybe you have some users that really don't care about Dask, and as far as they're concerned, Dask is another node in a larger workflow graph, of doing some model builds and reporting, and all they want to do is hit a button in the Prefect UI to run this model build, maybe for some experimentation. Maybe they want to drop in some config into the UI that configures how this experiment runs, and all they care about is that it turns green eventually, maybe after 1 hour. So there's some SLA on that node, and afterwards some report gets generated that then gets displayed, and then they go about their business. So all of these, I guess the main picture I'm trying to paint here is that there's certain ways where Prefect will manage how everything gets sent to Dask. That's the first. Second way, you can manage it. You can create a client yourself. and submit things as you want. And then lastly, you can just encapsulate all of this into one task if that's maybe the way you want to think about it.
So far to break them down, I think on the right side, Blackbox API, that's sort of Dask as a Spark replacement.
Yep, exactly.
And on the left side, it's kind of, native of the Prefect, that's kind of Dask as a finer grained Kubernetes.
Yep.
And in the middle, it's kind of like that, but with some like ML features rolled in case you got a more complicated situation involved.
Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we very frankly, we see all three of these, with varying degrees depending on kind of the makeup of a given team.
What do you see the most common? I'm curious.
I think the first, the native scaling. I think a lot of our users, definitely not all, of course, but a lot of our users who come to Prefect maybe didn't know about Dask and then begin using it and then, customizing it from there. And so just to kind of hit this point more, like what is the difference here? Like how do you use them both together? So you get orchestration in the front. So you visit the Prefect UI, maybe you see a couple of failures. Obviously all of the names here are not real. This is definitely fake data, I'll admit that. But you see some of these failures, you click into them, you realize that something's going wrong with maybe your coiled config. And so then you click in further, you get Dask in the back, and you figure out what's going wrong, at the layer that Dask knows and cares about. And so having kind of these click-throughs, and then maybe the workflow you're running on is actually something totally different that messed up. And so then you go to the relevant location there. But Prefect's kind of your central plane to figure out where to go next to unblock yourself. And so I guess this is just a rephrasing of the three bullet points you just had at like slightly higher level, which is just, you could use Prefect and Coiled pluggable backend. That's the first thing. So this is the executor interface. In this case, there's a one-to-one mapping. Prefect tasks become Dask tasks, and that's it. That's the level of granularity that you're accepting. So in this case, you're usually using Dask largely for good parallelism and not any of the more native like Dask collections or anything like that. But as an interface service, then you can get into actually, maybe you have a lot of Dask data frame manipulation that you care about. Why is this? There we go. So, Prefect can actually manage the creation of the Dask clients in a more transparent way. And so then you can customize those clients and customize what you're sending through those clients. And so this middle one is usually what people who are coming from Dask to Prefect want to do. And then the last one is that black box, right? Just some task in a larger workflow. We don't even know what Dask is. The only thing we care about is that it's a job that needs to run as a part of other things. And so I guess, Matt, you've been asking some questions, but like, what are some of the other questions that, you have or that you think some of your users have about how all of this works together? So or are there anything coming out of the chat?
Yeah, so I think the thing that comes to mind, so retries is a good example. Sorry, I'm inclined to go through your experiment before, like walking through all the steps that I would do with the script if I had to run the script every day, right? But I think when I or when others think about software projects, often we look like, this may be a reductive way of thinking about it. We think about like killer applications or killer features or things. With Dask, maybe it's Dask data frames and it's Dask arrays and it's some GPU stuff and it's like task graph parallelism, right? Those are like the things you think about, like, oh, it's like Spark, be like way more fine grained and in Python. And that's nice.
Yep. So I do actually have an answer now that we've gone through the whole kind of setup.
So if I'm a Dask user, of 5 years ago, I was like, okay, what would Prefect get me? Like one thing would be retries. I think retries was like a classic issue that I refused to implement for a very long time.
Wait, hang on. Talk more about that. Why did you refuse to implement it, Matt? It seems so simple.
It's not that simple. The state machinery around walking something back is actually pretty hard. And also, sometimes, like, if a task fails, like it should fail, like it's genuinely a constructive result. We ended up adding it. It's super easy to do. Sorry, not super easy to do, but it's super easy as a user to use now, thanks to some engineering work inside of Dask. But Prefect, Prefect was the library we would point people to if they needed retries. I think many people were using Dask pre-Prefect to do Prefect-like things. And that caused tension because they wanted this set of features that we really couldn't offer. Like, hey, I want to run this task every hour, please. We don't quite do that. It's not us. Go use cron and use Dask at the same time. And so, like in my mind, how I want to describe Prefect to Dask users is like, oh, it's like Dask, but with a cron-like capability in it, and with like a database service that's running. See if things are broken, I'll now add. Like, what are the 5 things that you would add on to Dask? Maybe that's the right way to say it. Let's say I want to get into business competing against Prefect, but starting from the Dask code base, what are the features I need to add into Dask in order to get to Prefect?
Oh, you're asking me that question?
I mean, if you're willing to give me the secret to success here, you're making your own competitor.
So I'll start with one that I know you definitely don't want to do, which is an off-the-shelf task library of common interfaces to different services.
Okay.
For example, kicking off a Databricks job is a popular one.
Probably not put in a Databricks job. That's true.
Kicking off Snowflake queries, things like that, just common activities, right? Even writing, I guess this one you probably already have in FS spec, but like writing to various, cloud storage locations, buckets, and things like that.
Again, feel free to like pass on the like product information here, but like what are the top 5 task library operations people use with Prefect? Just so you just have a sense for like what it might be used with. I imagine people hearing like, oh, I can use this with Snowflake. Great, I use Snowflake all the time. I'm going to check out that integration. What are some other common integrations?
I mean, yeah, DBT, Snowflake, Fivetran, every ETL service under the sun. Any database connection, opening and executing some query against it, that would count. Almost any service that has a exposed API for triggering things, like pretty generically, like Informatica even, like old school stuff too. So a lot of that. Another one would of course be scheduling, but actually not, most people don't like cron scheduling. So there's usually more business sort of scheduling that you want to do. So for example, every other Tuesday would be an example.
Okay.
You could do that in various ways.
So what I'm hearing, also, do you want to switch off of screen share if you don't have things? It might be more engaging to have
sure,
big faces rather than small faces.
Parameterization through an API. So it's like some sort of a web server aspect would be another one. So the ability to trigger a pipeline with some preferably typed parameter payload that then, alters some execution path.
Sorry, so there's like I can talk to the Prefect service out there and I can hit with an endpoint and say, run this job for me with an endpoint. That'll kick off a bunch of other tasks.
Yeah.
So I can put that into the scheduler, I can have in the Dask scheduler, I can put that into some other database or something like a coiled thing. And I can kick off jobs dynamically.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, a lot of our users don't use scheduling in the sense of time-based scheduling. They use it in event-based through the API. And then the event, of course, some JSON representation of it gets sent through. The other one that I think would probably be the biggest shakeup to the scheduler, if I had to guess, would be this idea that state has to get elevated one level up. And so failure becomes first class. So like if something fails in a certain way, then I want this next thing to happen, or I want the next thing to happen no matter what the state of the upstream is, as long as it's in some sort of terminal state. I think that's, or only running it. I mean, yeah, you get the idea there. Something that's a little bit more about like what the status of the upstream task was, not just what data it returned.
Okay. So let me recap some of the things you said here about why I would use Prefect on top of Dask. So retries for sort of the historical examples. I want to retry something if it fails. I want to be able to have access to a quick and easy library of common tooling that I'm probably already using. So I want to easily click off a Snowflake job, a Databricks job if you're so inclined. You mentioned also having a nice endpoint, like a set of endpoints that can kick off these jobs for me. So it's a nice centralized
some web server setup
to trigger a lot of jobs. And, and then subsequent jobs as well. There's the timing thing, so cron-like stuff. And then also being a lot more sensitive, a lot more sensible around exceptions and failures and what to do in those cases. That's really a first-class experience.
Yep.
Does that cover? Is that maybe like the 5 most common things?
No, I think there's another aspect of bookkeeping that's like, I'll just say as a large thing instead of going into detail here, which is, so audit trail is one thing. That's usually like most services, I think, will have some version of that, but also this kind of ability to slice and dice based on versions, for example. So having lots of different versions of a pipeline and being able to compare them over time on some metric, like just maybe how long they run or how often they fail. And so it'll like tags, other pieces of metadata that you might want to slice and dice by and get different views into. So I think that would be another thing, is like tracking the right amount and the right kind of aspects of that metadata, and then providing views into it in some meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
All right. If there are any questions from the audience, feel free to jump in. Or if there's any features, again, that Prefect adds on top of Dask that you want to shout out, please shout them out. Also, I've noticed a lot of people have been sending direct messages to the panelists, which is the default chat option. So when you're sending a chat, you want to select the drop down and to say to panelists and all attendees, or to everyone. But I'll let that sit for another minute. What should Dask add to itself, Chris, that would make Prefect users' lives easier? So I've asked you before, what should Dask add in order to compete with Prefect? What should Dask add in order to augment Prefect or make it better?
I'm sure if Michael is out there, there we go. Michael or Kevin will have more opinions, I think. I can't. Oh, heterogeneous. Yeah, so having.
So Kevin Coe put in the chat, having heterogeneous clusters available from Coiled. So as Dask users know, you can start Dask workers on a variety of different machines. You can annotate them differently. Dask will respect memory and CPU differences on them. We want to say, hey, this machine has access to special hardware like GPUs. And some people want to have a mixed group of workers. Coiled does not actually support this by default yet. We don't do that.
So Dask, though, specifically, actually, thank you, Kevin. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that like auto scaling in heterogeneous clusters is not really a thing in Dask.
It's not a thing. It's actually a frequent request from some of our larger users. But
yeah, so we hear that quite a bit.
So I want to dig into that for a second. So the use case that we often see there, so to be clear, like Dask does this. We just haven't it's enough of an expert use case. We haven't prioritized it in Coiled yet. But
You're talking about the auto scaling or the heterogeneous part?
Sorry, not auto scaling, heterogeneous. I mean, you could do auto scaling too if you got very, very fancy. But so the common use case there is you've got a few machines with GPUs, often that are doing some training of a machine learning model. And you have a lot of other machines that are a lot cheaper that are pulling data from the cloud, doing some pre-processing, and then shipping that data into those heavy GPU machines. That's the common use case for us. It's a pretty common use case among expert users. Is that also what you all see the need for and with heterogeneity? Is it this mixed sort of like expensive training plus very cheap pre-processing?
100%. Yep. Okay. Large memory machines or machines with GPUs.
Okay.
Oh yeah, off-the-shelf logging actually would be quite.
So we actually added a new feature recently. So there's a whole event logging system in Dask where all of the workers can trigger events to go to the scheduler, and the client can choose to register them. It's kind of like Kafka topics in like a very centralized, simplified way. But for example, there's now a from Dask distributed import print command where like you can print on any worker function, it'll show up in your local console. You can do the same thing with logging if you wanted to. We're starting to make more sort of centralized information feeding systems for this stuff. So if you guys wanted to, I suspect you actually hack the existing functionality of that pretty easily and capture that.
Interesting.
We added some of this stuff for Coiled, but it ended up in the open source. We haven't made as much noise about it as we probably should. But event, I think it's log event or event log, one of those two methods on the worker is a convenient thing to look at. Any other requests from the audience? If not, we might let Chris go.
We're close to time too, so.
Should have heckled more. Evan Curtin complains to not make him install GraphViz in order to see the Dask DAG with the visualize command. You can always use the Dask dashboard; it's available there. But yeah, that's a fair concern.
We have that right now too, where we use GraphViz. Same story. You can see it in the dashboard, but locally you need GraphViz.
That is a long-lived tool.
It works.
Something we've been considering, Chris, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on it, is increased use of Rich. Are you familiar with Rich?
I've heard of it. Is this
This is like the Rich console.
Documentation?
So Rich is a Rich console library. It allows you to do like colors or bold or progress bars all in the console. It's quite nice. I recommend people take a look at it. But you could probably build some sort of graph visualization thing just in console with Rich. It's surprisingly nice. We started using it with Coiled recently, and it's definitely been a crowd pleaser.
I mean, it's interesting. I think this actually highlights one of the differences in maybe I don't know if it's the user base necessarily or just the use case itself between Prefect and Dask, is that a lot of our console related tooling is for the setup and deployment of pipelines and workflows. But the way in which you like inspect them and interact with them is through either API or dashboard. They're very remote usually. And people interact with them like not through the machines, but through, and I think, and it's usually because, right, it's like scheduled or triggered via other services and things like that. Whereas with Dask, you're like, it's very hands-on. You're like, I'm working on this right now, so I want to be, in my console.
Yeah, Prefect is all about like workflow automation that'll happen some other time. Dask is sometimes used for data engineering that happens some other time, and we care about aggregating logs, getting performance reports, all that stuff. But Dask is also often used interactively. And so we care a lot about making sure that human timescale responsiveness and that feedback is really, that real-time feedback is really rich. Does no one uses Prefect in an interactive way?
No, that's not true, but it's usually for like development mode. Like whenever you're first building your workflow, you almost certainly are running it interactively, which is totally fine, but there's not, well, I guess this isn't strictly true anymore, but in the past, there wasn't any state persistence of what you're doing. So it's very like ephemeral. And then when you deployed it is when you started to get all of the statefulness associated with it. But yeah, usually people are not running their actual deployed workflows in an interactive environment. I mean, that's, there's some slice of people that do, but most people don't.
Okay. Well, let's close things up. Chris, always lovely to chat with you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, Chris and I were having beers last week and totally forgot about this thing this week, but we'll get beers some other time. Yeah.
Sounds like a good plan. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much to both of you. It was awesome. And thanks to everyone in the audience. Cool. Have an awesome rest of your night.
You too.
All right.